Scenes from a chilling night on August the 11th in the US city of Charlottesville, Virginia, when white supremacists and neo-Nazis marched to stop a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from being taken down. Those Unite the Right protests on Friday led to a counter-demonstration on Saturday, which brought violent confrontations, a state of emergency, as well as the death of 32-year-old protester Heather Hare.
We have to become something greater than ourselves. We have to become part of a family, part of a story. And that's what the alt-right is.
It's been well documented that these white supremacists are homegrown Americans, but some argue that their cause is also being supported from abroad. A theory perpetuated at another alt-right rally in May.
Russia is our friend!
And the feeling could be mutual. A report published last month by a US intelligence agency noted, as with all of its 2016 election active measures, Russia is not planting seeds of discord and strife, but rather providing fertilizer and sunlight to an already existing bitter crop. Admiration of the Kremlin is something leading supremacists have no intention of hiding. Extreme nationalist Richard Spencer believes Russia is the sole white power in the world, while former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke says Moscow holds the key to white survival. And they are backed up by the head of the white nationalist traditionalist worker party, Matthew Heimbach, who recently described Russian President Vladimir Putin as the leader of the free world and a person who has helped morph Russia into an axis for nationalists. But is there really admiration from both sides? Analysts say it doesn't make sense that Putin would support neo-Nazism given the millions of Russians they killed in World War II, while others make the point that President Putin supports Muslims within his country, opening Europe's largest mosque in Moscow in 2015. But Putin is used to being blamed for influencing America, given Russian hackers were accused of tampering with last year's US presidential election.
I can tell you honestly, I wish we had such an efficient, powerful propaganda machine in Russia, but unfortunately we don't.
So are America's white supremacists fabricating a relationship that doesn't exist? Or is President Putin simply playing the puppeteer? Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Olga Khostunova. She's a political analyst and researcher at the Institute of Modern Russia. And in London, we have Marcus Papadopoulos. He's a Russia analyst and an editor at Politics First magazine. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Olga, let me ask you very directly then. Is Russia supporting the white supremacist, neo-Nazi / alt-right movement in the United States?
Well, we have to define first the term supporting. So if you mean, is it funding those groups? I don't know if there is any proof of that. But if we are talking about, extending a hand or pronouncing some warm words of support, then definitely that's true. And there are various examples of that, starting from the International Russian Conservative Forum in St. Petersburg, where a number of ultra-nationalist parties and groups and movements were presented. And they all received a warm welcome from Moscow, and that forum was funded by the Kremlin.
Okay.
So in that sense, yes.
Okay, so Marcus, they're not really funding it. Maybe they're giving it a little nudge and an amplification. Does that make sense to you?
Look, the fact we're having this discussion in the first place is another reminder of the malignant power of the West, the power to deceive, the power to accuse other countries in the world of doing the very things that the American and British governments have been doing. And let's also not forget that this allegation against Russia of supporting white supremacists is extraordinarily offensive and disrespectful to Russians. The Russian people, along with the Jewish people, suffered tremendously at the hands of the Nazis. Indeed, the suffering of the Russian people and the Jewish people at the hands of Nazism is unequaled in history. 27 million Soviet people died because of the Nazis. President Putin's brother died in the siege of Leningrad. His grandmother was murdered by the Nazis. He had numerous uncles who never returned from the front. It is absolutely disgraceful that this unfounded allegation is being put out by Western politicians and Western media outlets.
Okay, so Olga, the West is in denial. They have their own social problems. They're just blaming Russia for their own social problems and trying to deflect. Olga, come back.
I just wanted to make a quick note because I'm a Russian person and I can speak for some of the people who shared my views and my values. And I have to make a difference between the Russian government, the Kremlin, and the Russian people, because if the Russian government or any government whatsoever in a democratic country, and Russia claims it is a democratic country in the constitution, there's something that the government can do that the people may not agree. So in that sense, if there is an allegation that the Russian government may be funding those groups and there is evidence to that, that is more offensive to me and I think to the Russian people.
Okay, totally.
Can you cite evidence?
Okay, so hold on. Let's move on. Let me try and figure out whether there might be ideological connections or whether it might just be pragmatic or it might just be coincidental, right? So let's try and get to the bottom of some of this. Marcus, I spoke to Alexander Dugin a few months ago. He's seen by, and you would agree, there's ample evidence that he's seen by many on the American alt-right as a kind of, almost in a way, a kind of spiritual father of new ideas, right? This anti-globalist idea. I spoke to him. Here's what he had to say about the presidency of Donald Trump. Have a little listen.
And he will try to make America America again, because before it wasn't America, it was a kind of globalist hub to impose on civilization and humanity. It's completely irrational, radical, anti-human values, so-called gay marriages, transhumanism, feminism, aggressive feminism. And I think now there is sane America, Trump's America, against ill America, sick America.
Marcus, would you agree that perhaps ideologically there's a kissing point between some of this kind of Russian nationalism, this Eurasianism, and some of what the alt-right is saying, and therefore that's why these guys warm to the likes of Dugin, and maybe from the Kremlin, there's a bit of an amplification going on?
First of all, I regard nationalism, be it American nationalism or English nationalism or French nationalism or Russian nationalism, as vile as Islamism, as vile as Wahhabism. If we're talking about Alexander Dugin, his views are his views only. They do not reflect the views of the Kremlin. And indeed, I think too much is made in Western media about Alexander Dugin and his influence on President Putin. I disagree to a great extent with a lot of Alexander Dugin's views. I do agree with him when it comes to his view on Ukraine. Ukraine is a historical part of Russia. Indeed, 90% of most of the former Soviet Union is historically Russian territory. But I do not agree with Mr. Dugin's views when it comes to Donald Trump. And Mr. Dugin has been proved to be absolutely incorrect if he thought that Donald Trump was going to be a different American president. But I don't want to go on a tangent. What I do want to say is that the reason why there is white supremacy on the rise in North America and Europe is down to a failed economic system in the West, the failure of the neoliberal capitalist system to look after all in society. That is why the extreme right is rising. And the Americans and the British have the audacity to accuse Russia of being complicit in the rise of neo-Nazism. Well, excuse me, it's Washington and London who's been supporting neo-Nazis and neo-fascists in Ukraine.
Okay.
Who enabled the leadership of Viktor
but they would argue
Yanukovych
there's
to be
much
overthrown in February 2014 by fascists and Nazis? It was the Americans and the British.
But they would argue there's as much or as little evidence of that.
Yes, but every year in the Baltic states there are veteran Waffen-SS veteran parades every year in the Baltic states. There's never been a condemnation by the Americans or the British.
Okay,
Why?
but you're accusing them of supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine with as much evidence as you're claiming is lacking
in
the US. Fair enough.
They did that to bring a pro-Western government to Kiev.
Fair enough. Okay.
Absolutely.
Let me ask Olga. Olga, might this be pragmatic? I remember I was in the United States in 2011. At that time, RT was just growing in the United States. They wholeheartedly embraced the Occupy movement, and a lot of that was sort of on the fringes of the left, right? And you almost, in many ways, you got the impression from RT as if it was sort of Tahrir Square in New York or in Washington, D.C. So might it just be pragmatic that from the Kremlin, they keep America busy. If ever there's something bubbling socially in the country, it's a little way to have a little nudge and a poke at the United States. But it might not actually be ideologically coming from Russia.
I may just make a few notes on what's been said by Marcus. So I agree on Alexander Dugin's influence on Putin. I don't think it's a very influential figure. He does represent marginal views. I agree that the rise of the ultra-right is the result of economic stagnation. However, I don't think that the West is supporting Nazis in Ukraine, and there are some ultra-right groups in Kiev. However, I don't think there is any evidence they have that much influence that's being amplified by the Kremlin, and there is no fascist junta in Kiev, has been said. So going back to Putin's policies, I think we have to say that they have changed since the annexation of Crimea. So that was the turning point in Russia's foreign policy and the way Russia has been treating marginal groups around the West. So to sort of avoid international isolation after the annexation of Crimea, the Kremlin and Mr. Putin decided to look at what can be done to sort of take Russia out of this closing door. And what can be done better if you ally with groups around the West who do support the same cause as Russia, which is weaker European institutions, Western institutions, because those groups view them as failing and the result and the cause of all the evil in the world. So that's why the Kremlin reaches out to them. Well, in Europe, we can have a bunch of ultra-right parties that the Kremlin, I mean, there is only evidence that it's been funding the National Front in France. But there is a
National
number
Front
of
in France
groups,
is not a fascist or a Nazi party, come on.
Yeah. It is a nationalist
I don't
movement.
like the National Front in France.
Party.
I don't like them at all. But you can't really argue it's a fascist party or a Nazi party. Come on, we have to be reasonable.
I don't argue
we have
that.
to be level-headed.
You're confusing what I've been saying. No, that's not what I said. You asked about the groups that the Kremlin has been reaching out to, and this is one of those groups. And there is evidence that the Kremlin has
but you're
funded
saying
it.
that the Kremlin's been reaching out to white supremacist groups in Europe, and you named National Front.
Okay,
I didn't say that.
People consider the National Front on the far right. People consider the National Front on the far right. As per your earlier argument, maybe there might be those people, Marcus, who might say, hey, come on, the Russians sacrificed millions of lives against the far right half a century ago. Why would they be supporting them? But let's put Marine Le Pen and Front National to the side for a second. Olga, let me ask you, is it harder for you to prove your thesis at a time when there seems to be a bit of Russia mania going on, particularly amongst Democrats and liberals in the United States in the post-election atmosphere, because a lot of people believe that Hillary Clinton should have won that election and that Russia rigged the election on behalf of Donald Trump. It doesn't quite check out because she won the popular vote, right? But there's a belief that Russia hacked the election, and there's a belief that Russia gave the election to Trump. And because of that, does it make it harder for you to prove your argument that Russia's meddling in the United States with these far-right groups? Olga?
I think there is sort of Russophobia going on here in the US, and not in a sense that Marcus is describing it, but more like the left and liberal media and Democratic Party are trying to understand what has happened and why Donald Trump is the president. So the only reason they try to channel their anger is to, point to the obvious culprit, which is Russia, because Russia has been meddling in the media and has been meddling in the West for a while now, and this is an easy target.
Okay.
So this is really easy to point to Putin and say he's the person behind all of it.
Russia has been meddling in the internal affairs of Western countries. How would you explain NATO's presence on Russia's borders? How would you explain the American missile defense shield aimed at Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent? How would you explain the Americans lusting after one former Soviet republic after another to come into NATO?
I'm glad they're all rhetorical questions, Marcus.
If on their borders there was a Russian-led military alliance?
I'm glad they're all rhetorical questions because we have run out of time. It's been great having both your perspectives on the program. Olga and Marcus, I thank you for coming on to the Newsmakers.